Okay, and we are live. That's great. Okay, everyone. Well, thank you all for coming along to our next installment in the Rights Club series. Today we're joined by Dr. Julia Rohrer. Before we go on to today's talk, I'm just going to go through a bit of housekeeping and a few announcements, but I'll try and keep this as brief as possible because I want to give as much time to Julia as is possible. Just a quick announcement. So recently the Rights Club has officially supported by the UK Reproducibility Network, a wonderful initiative, peer-led consortium that supports rigorous research practices. So it's nice to be counted among the other initiatives that UK are in support. Thanks to a wonderful idea from one of our team members, Alex, we did a follow Friday and we had a wonderful response. So there's a lot of new followers. So for those who are new to the Rights Club, you can find all of our content on our Twitter page at Rights Science Club. You can also find all the slides on our OSF page and of course the YouTube channel. But the main sort of contact point would definitely be our website, which is under the sort of control of Olivia, which is a wonderful member of the team keeping on top of all that. Okay, so let's go on to today's talk and get down to business. So today we are joined by Julia, all the way from the metropolis that is Germany. It was effectively COVID-free compared to the rest of the world. Julia is a personality psychologist by training, and her work covers a broad range of topics, including effects of birth order, age patterns in personality. She has methodological interests in causal inferences on the basis of observational data and data analytical flexibility, which is very germane to today's talk. And she's an active advocate, of course, in research transparency. She recently finished her doctoral degree at the International Max Planck Research School on the live course, and now is a lecturer in the Department of Psychology at the University of Leipzig. And I don't know where she finds the time, but she's also a co-contributor to the 100% CI blog as well, along with a previous speaker, Anna Shear. Okay, so Julia, I see you're sharing your slides. I will hand the keys over to you. Thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Thank you for the nice introduction. So today I want to talk a bit about a nice stroll through the garden of talking pets. And so let's assume you got some data, you got your research question, and now you need to analyze your data to answer your question. So in theory, you know what you want to do, but there's multiple ways you can analyze your data. For example, if you're running an experiment, well, you have to decide which exclusion criteria to apply or which conditions you want to compare and so on. Or maybe if you're working with observational data, you have to decide which covariates to include or how to aggregate survey questions into scales and so forth. So you're quickly confronted with a large number of options that result in more and more possible analyses that you could run. So what do you do about this? Well, one way to deal with it is essentially you just start running analyses. So let's see what we find if you follow that one path. Well, maybe the results don't quite fit our expectations, so maybe we did something wrong and try a different analysis. And we just keep doing that until at a certain point we might find something that we agree with. So we essentially decide this was actually the analysis we should have run to begin with, and we report our results as hypothesized, we found that, and so on. And as most of you may be aware, this is problematic because it can lead to many false positives findings. So what do we do about that? One approach that has become pretty popular is pre-registration. So pre-registration is essentially that idea that you limit yourself to one path, but actually there are multiple ways to achieve this. So one way is, yes, you pre-register your analysis, you have a timestamped document that says I'm going to do this and that. But it's also possible that your lab is running similar experiments over and over again, so you might develop something like standard operating procedures. And then you might have heard of people who argue that actually pre-registration is redundant at best because very strong theory actually constrains your choices. So that is another way to constrain researcher degrees of freedoms. But there's an alternative idea to that first approach, and that's what I call the second approach. And that is essentially, instead of straight walking to your goal, is taking a leisurely stroll and following multiple paths and then reporting all findings transparently. And so this is what I want to focus on in this talk today. And because everybody loves mixed metaphors, I call this into the multiverse of multiverse style analyses. And I want to give you an overview of different approaches that could be used, highlight both the differences and commonalities, and maybe help you generate some new ideas for your own research, but also maybe highlight some critical points in these types of analyses. So this approach number 2, which I call like multiverse style analysis, is actually a huge bunch of different styles of analysis you could run. And I want to introduce a couple of these to you, but I want to focus on essentially the parts where they are different from each other. So those are the questions like, how many analyses do you actually run? How do you decide which analysis to run? How do you report all these results? And do you integrate the results in some way, or do you just keep them the way they are? And to start maybe with the simplest options, there are robustness checks. And most of you might have heard of these or used them before. So they essentially just ask the question, do my results change if I change my analysis in a specific way? For example, do I still find evidence after accounting for a covariate, or do I still find evidence after applying various outlier criteria? And I think these are most common in economics, where they are like a standard part, so you always have to report them, but they are also becoming more common in psychology and other fields. So going back to these like dimension where these analyses can vary, so considering the scope, robustness checks are pretty open-ended. So this could be anything from running one additional analysis to running 1,000 additional analyses. But what robustness checks have in common is that the standard framing is that you have a main analysis on which you focus in your manuscript, and then you also report alternative analysis where you always like vary one aspect. At least that's the standard format. Considering the presentation, this can be pretty much anything. You frequently see just like single footnotes. These results remain essentially unchanged if covariate X is included, and so on. It can also be a manuscript section. So I've done that before, where I essentially just report additional analyses, changing one thing after the other. It can also be something like a comprehensive online appendix. I'm actually going to show you an example afterwards. And considering the integration of results, that's like a huge question mark. So normally when you read the published literature, you will notice that more often than not, robustness checks are successful. So when they are normally reported, it means that the results are robust. And so that kind of raises the question of what is actually going on there. I guess the cynical interpretation is that people report robustness checks selectively, so they only report them when they are favorable. But of course, there's another possibility, that is, if it turns out that an analysis is not robust, they discard the main analysis or go back and fix something. So it's very hard to figure out how robustness checks are reported and whether they are reported in a selective manner. I got an example for you here that is from a very talented student, Laura Butzet. We were working together on the effects of birth order position on personality. And what you can see here is her GitHub homepage, where she lists all these additional analyses for the project. So essentially, you can click your way through, you can change parts of the analysis, For example, you can decide you want to analyze a different measure of intelligence, or you use a different definition of birth order, or you include nonlinear birth order effects, and so on. You can see the results for all of these analyses. And I've also added a little link in there. It's a blog post by my co-blogger Ruben Aslan, who actually wrote a tutorial on how to do such reproducible websites for your robustness checks. Now, of course, this is already fairly comprehensive for a robustness check. So the question arises, oh, is this still just a robustness check, or aren't we moving on to more comprehensive approaches? So let's move to the next thing, the so-called computational solution. So this is something that has been suggested by Cristobal Young, a sociologist. And Young talks about model uncertainty, so uncertainty about how to best model your data and how this contributes to the current crisis in science. And in his paper, he suggests three solutions. So the one thing is the Uber log file. If anybody of you is working with Stata, you might be aware that Stata has these log files that log everything you've done, and he suggests that there should be an Uber log file that essentially registers all your keystrokes and everything you do in Stata. He also suggests a task force approach, and I'm actually going to talk about something very similar later on. I just call it the many analysts approach. But most importantly, he suggests something he calls the computational solution. And for this, you specify a number of plausible model ingredients. So, for example, different covariates, different exclusion criteria, different models to analyze your data. And then you run models of all possible combinations. And in his manuscript, he presents one such analysis, and the results are presented in this way. So what you can see here essentially is the results of all of these analyses. That's the text migration estimate. And it's just the density distribution. So you can just see how those results are distributed. And he also gives an example of a cherry-picked estimate. So if you chose something that gave like a particularly large value, you could report that as a significant effect. But of course, if you look at the full distribution, the picture doesn't look as convincing. What is really helpful about Young's approach, and also this paper in particular, is that he suggests three categories to describe the outcome. So the best case scenario for the analyst is that the findings are robust. So you get similar results across all models, and the distribution of your estimates will be essentially shifted away from zero, or will be like very close around zero, just so that you get essentially an easy answer. What can also happen is that there's systematic variability. So you find that the results strongly depends on a few model ingredients. For example, including one covariate makes all the difference. And in that case, it might be necessary to run some follow-up analyses to find out why this is the case, to find an explanation, and then to decide which of the possible answers is the right one. And the third thing he describes is knife-edge specifications. That is essentially a result that only shows up in a highly specific combination of model ingredients. So you have to apply a certain transformation, include a certain control variable, exclude a certain set of people, and only then do you find a reliable effect. And so this is, of course, the category that we would normally suspect might be a false positive. It need not be one, but it surely does look not very robust. So this approach, like the so-called computational solution, has this very broad scope that all possible combinations of model ingredients are reported. And the presentation that Young suggests is just like a distribution of estimates. And that means that you can get like a nice overall visual impression, but you can no longer trace single specifications and find out which numbers they returned. And considering the integration of results, he essentially suggests this holistic assessment, robust, systematic, or knife edge, but he doesn't really provide more guidance on how to do that in specific cases. So this computational solution, I think, is not very well known in psychology, but it's a nice example of convergent evolution, because, of course, what many people have heard of in psychology is so-called multiverse analysis. And so This will now sound all very similar to the computational solution, but it does have the catchier name, which is probably why it's a bit more popular. So the idea here is that you got a multiverse of possible data sets that result from different data pre-processing pipelines. And that is essentially the same what Young is talking about when he talks about all possible combinations of model ingredients. And once again, the idea is that you analyze every single data set and then you report all of the results. And so the original paper on multiverse analysis also has an example analysis and also provides a possible visualization of results. And it looks like this. I don't know whether you've seen this before or not. You might notice that, first of all, it's not very intuitive, I guess. So essentially what you can see here is the p-value of different model specifications. I think those that are below 0.05 are highlighted. And then you need to like trace those little letters and look it up in a table to find out what model this actually was. So multiverse analysis does have the same scope as the computational solution, that is all combinations of plausible data pre-processing steps. And the presentation is that multiverse plot. I'm not entirely sure whether they are really recommending that you should do it or whether it's just possible visualization. It does have that advantage that you can actually look up any single model if you feel like it. You just don't get like a nice overall visual impression. And considering the integration of results, this manuscript is also rather vague. They do mention that one reasonable first step may be to simply average the p-values, which is probably not statistically 100% adequate, but might give a nice first impression. But as you might have seen, like those two approaches, they are fairly unsystematic. So let's move on to something that is much more formalized. And that is specification curve analysis, which has been suggested by Simonson, Simmons, and Nelson. The year I put down here is 2015. I think that's when they initially posted their preprint. I do think the manuscript has still not been published in a peer-reviewed journal, so that's something to keep in the back of your mind. And so I have applied that approach myself in 2017, so I will give you some substantive background to illustrate this example. So as Sam mentioned, I'm doing birth order research, and birth order research is kind of really interesting if you look at its history. So there was an early stage of birth order research where people got really excited because birth order had all sorts of effect on various personality traits. But then in the 70s, there was a paper by Schooler that essentially said birth order effects not here, not now, made a very strong case that these effects actually do not exist or are not reliable. And Ernst and Angst went even further and did a meta-analysis of all studies published on the topic and simply concluded that this kind of research is a sheer waste of time and money. So that could have been the end of birth order research. But in 1997, Frank Salloway, a historian of science, published a book called Born to Rebel. He essentially analyzed the lives of historical personalities with respect to their birth order position. For example, he looked at scientific revolutions, categorized them as either conservative or progressive, and then looked whether the researcher was a firstborn or a later born. And his idea was that lastborns are the ones that are rebellious, that push the world ahead, and the firstborns are the conservatives one. And this book was a huge hit. It led to a lot of birth order research, and Salloway eventually also extended his research into the Big Five, which is the standard personality system that is being used by personality psychologists right now. So once again, we had like another era of, oh, birth order actually has all sorts of effects on various traits, and this is all very exciting. Until in 2015, there were actually two really large-scale investigations that both failed to find noticeable effects on the Big Five. And one of them was my first paper. So this could have been the end once again, but there's yet more studies coming out reporting various birth order effects. So in the short version of this is it's a huge mess. But actually, it has been a huge mess for a long time. And I happened to read Judith Harris, the nurture assumption, and actually in the appendix, she describes birth order research. So she talks about what previous studies looked like, and she writes, the slash marks of divide and conquer are clearly visible in many of the studies reviewed by Ernst and Angst. Significant birth order effects were found for males, but not for females, or vice versa, or for middle-class subjects, but not for working class, or vice versa, or for people from small families, but not from large ones, or for high school students, but not college-age subjects. And so this may sound very familiar to you because it essentially describes what we're now thinking of this p-hacking, where you try things until you find something and then you report a significant effect. So after I'd read it, I decided that I wanted to revisit the birth order topic, but from that perspective that there might be some issues going on there with researcher degrees of freedom. So once again, we ventured into the garden of forking paths, and now I got like more specific examples to you. So for example, for our analysis, we had to decide, do age gaps between siblings matter? So naively, one could think, well, a sibling is a sibling, so age gaps shouldn't matter a lot. So that's one possible specification. There have also been arguments that once there is like a certain number of years between siblings, they are no longer growing up with normal sibling dynamics. So for example, if your older brother is 20 years older, well, maybe he's more like an uncle. So according to that, we excluded larger age gaps. But then there are also people who have argued that if siblings are virtually the same age, so only 1 year apart, then they probably don't have those traditional dynamics as well. So maybe that's more like twins. So again, we excluded those. And next, there's the question, what is actually a sibling? So we used, in our first study, we used like a social definition. So this includes all types of siblings as long as you grew up together. But there have been arguments that actually only full biological siblings should matter. It's because of some evolutionary reasons. So we said, okay, let's include this as a specification, and so on. So we ended up with a large number of different specifications. Overall, I think at least 720 per analysis. So we ran all these models on our data. And I'm now going to present you a specification curve plot. So if you look here at the upper panel and you see like the small mark, that is the estimate of one effect. So you can see here we get the outcome positive reciprocity, which doesn't really matter in this case. But we estimate a negative effect of being later born, that is like about minus 0.4 standard deviations. And if you want to figure out what type of analysis that was, you can take a look at the lower panel. And there you can see, it's the analysis where we restricted age gaps. We only analyzed sibships with 4 children. We did not control for age. We included all siblings. Gender is not included in the model. And we only ran within family analysis. So we only compared actual siblings. And we now do this for all combinations within the model. And then we can plot the results ordered by size and get like a nice visual impression of the distribution of effects. And the red lines are the one that would be considered traditionally statistically significant. So p is below 0.05, though of course you wouldn't interpret the p-values like that in this case. And on the lower panel, we just add the legend again. So this is a specification curve plot, which I already find rather neat, just because it gives you that nice visual impression of the distribution, but you can still look up every single model if you want to. But the specification curve approach goes even further and suggests a way to statistically evaluate all of this. So the problem with just counting the significant effects or something like that, or just aggregating the p-values, is that the model results are not independent tests. So the p-values are not independent. There's a solution to this though, and that is generating an approximation of the distribution under the null hypothesis of no effect. And what Simonson et al. Suggested in their original manuscript is essentially you randomly scramble the independent variable of interest. In our case, we just randomly assign birth order position within certain constraints. So somebody from a family with 3 kids can only be first, second, or third born. And then you have a new data set in which you know that birth order position cannot have an effect on anything because it has been randomly assigned. You run a specification curve analysis on the newly generated data set, and you calculate the metric of interest. For example, this could be median effect size. We focused on the number of specifications that are below the traditional significance threshold, mainly because we wanted to make a point about cherry-picking results. It's probably not the most sensible thing to choose. And once you have calculated the metric of interest for that scrambled data, you can repeat that a few times. We did it 500 times. And that gives you a distribution of the metric of interest under the null hypothesis. And then, just as with normal significance testing, you can compare the metric you observe in your actual data to the distribution under the null hypothesis. So if we return to the example we had earlier, where we found a few significant effects, but also a lot of specifications that are non-significant, we can apply that permutation test. And for example, here we found a p-value of 0.154, so we concluded there's overall no evidence for a significant effect. But to give you a different example, we had another outcome variable that was a single item measure in which respondents stated whether they are eager for knowledge. And the idea here is that this is measuring self-reported intellect, which is a subscale of openness. It's just like a really crude measure. But if you look at the specification curve here, it actually lights up like a Christmas tree. And maybe unsurprisingly, none of our permutated data set had that many significant specifications. So it did indeed look like there was, across our specifications, very reliable evidence that birth order position has an effect on that single item. So to summarize specification curve analysis, once again, we are doing all combinations of possible decisions. But specification curve comes with that very nice specification curve plot where single model specifications can still be identified. And even better, it allows researchers to calculate a p-value for the whole curve. Now there's, I think, two issues with that approach. So the first thing is, as I mentioned before, the method itself has not been peer-reviewed yet. And I do think that Simonson, Simmons, and Nelson, who are not statisticians, are probably stuck in eternal peer review. And that might make some sense because I think the inferential properties of this whole approach are sort of unknown. So I know at least one person who's working on that and doing their PhD on this matter, but essentially it's being applied. It is kind of intuitive. I'm not 100% sure how accurate the results are, in particular when it comes to that overall p-value. And of course, the second issue is there still needs to be somebody who decides what gets included into the curve. And this is true for all other approaches as well. Which parts of the specification are varied and which aren't is still a researcher degree of freedom. And it's still possible that researchers might be biased, that they might ignore aspects that matter. And so for that purpose, it could be helpful to pick multiple brains. And that is the idea behind what I call many analyst approaches. You might have heard of the Many Analysts project. I think it has been published. And the Many Analysts project started from archival data on skin color, red cards, and other covariates of football players. And the research question was, are dark-skinned players more likely to receive red cards? And so these data and this research question was handed out to 29 different teams of analysts with different backgrounds. And so the idea here is that you got the same data and the same research question, although you might argue about the research question part because it was a bit underspecified. But now you can just look at how different the answers are that the people can come up with. And here is a figure from the final paper. So what you can see here is that the different teams came up with a lot of different data analytic approaches. And you can also see that there is quite some spread in the resulting effect sizes, which are here reported as odds ratios. I think this paper made quite a bit of a splash because people were like, oh, this can result in so much variability. Maybe because of my background, I was rather surprised how similar all these results are. So it does look much clearer than other examples that I've seen, which is encouraging in this case. There's another nice project that used the crowd to get better results, and that was the Fragile Families Challenge, which just got published. And this was a really nice project that used data from the Fragile Families study, which is essentially a longitudinal study of families at risk. And they had data for 3,200 families, and they had a huge number of variables. So all sorts of background variables, longitudinal information on the kids and so on. And the aim of the challenge was to predict outcomes for the children at age 15. So they were supposed to predict GPA, grid, material hardship, and other outcomes. And what is special about this is it's a prediction challenge, which is kind of uncommon, I think, outside of data science. So researchers got access to all these background variables, and they also got some of the outcomes. That was the year 15 training data, but there was a holdout test data set, so they didn't get all the outcomes. And in the end, teams were evaluated on the basis of whether or not they were able to predict the test data they had never seen before. And to show you some results from this, they in the end they chose the best submission for each outcome. And so what you can see here is the R squared of the holdout, so variance explained in the holdout. You can see the different outcomes, and the line you see here now is the benchmark, and the benchmark was really just like a super simple model. So regression including demographics of the mother and a proxy of the outcome at age 9. And now people applied all their fancy machine learning, and what did they get out of there? Well, they got some improvement in predictive accuracy, but you can also see that it wasn't that much. And the models that have been submitted also allow you to take a closer look at the disagreement between the models, which model choices mattered most, and so on. So this many analyst approach, again, is like an approach in the broadest possible sense. So you essentially have all the analysis that the different teams come up with, so not necessarily all combinations. How the results are presented is pretty open, and integration of results is open as well. I still think it's worth mentioning because it's a really nice idea to make use of different skills and perspectives from within the scientific community. And it might, to some extent, reduce incentives to achieve a certain result. Because first of all, your result is not going to be the only result, so maybe it doesn't make much sense to p-hack because the others might not do the same thing that you do. It might also potentially reduce biases, though I'm not 100% convinced of that because, of course, researchers in a given community might have shared biases. So this might be much more valuable if people from different fields collaborate. So I've now introduced you to 5 different approaches to these multiverse style analyses, but there's a couple of points that I find important in general, namely the question of meta-hacking, like how to distinguish between systematic variability and knife edge specifications. Then the most important question of how to present the results, which isn't quite that easy, and then in the end some advice on how to get started. So meta-hacking. Researchers can still influence results and reports selectively with all of these methods. So for example, robustness checks, as I mentioned, why do they rarely ever show that something isn't robust? Wouldn't there need to be a lot of not so robust analyses published? For computational solution, multiverse, and specification curves, where which model ingredients or data pre-processing steps or specifications are considered. And even in the many analysts case, what if people in the field share the same bias, right? So there is still a lot of room for bias to influence results. And so when I published my specification curve paper Felix Thomas, who does causal inference research, was like, oh, yeah, this is really cool. Did you pre-register your analysis? So I do think it might in some cases be necessary to pre-register whatever one is doing. So pre-registered robustness checks, multiverse analysis, specification curves. Of course, this only increases the complexity of pre-registration. I'm not entirely sure whether this is always necessary, but I do think I've already seen one specification analysis that looked clearly p-hacked. So I don't know how easy it is to actually influence results, but I guess there is a lot of room to fool oneself, so it might be necessary to combine these approaches. Then in particular, when results are ambiguous, it's actually really hard to distinguish between systematic variability and knife edge specifications. So when we see knife edge specification, these are likely variance false positives, so where sometimes you're going to get a significant effect even if there's nothing going on. But if there's systematic variability, it's more like one of the finding is biased, so it's reliably wrong. It's a biased false positive or false negative. And how do we decide in these cases, which answer is the correct one? So is there effect? Is there an effect? Is there no effect? And this actually is closely linked to that hidden moderators debate, where after failed replications, the original authors will sometimes point out, oh, but there was something different in the study. For example, you didn't sample students from Midwestern universities in the US, so of course you couldn't find the effect because the effect doesn't show in the Netherlands. But there are also other examples where maybe there are more plausible arguments why there would be systematic differences. And that is something where one can very easily start arguments, and that's the same for these robustness checks. And I would like to show you one example of systematic variability where I've convinced myself that it's systematic, but maybe you might disagree. And that is, again, from our birth order studies, and we are looking at the outcome of conscientiousness. So Frank Sulloway says that firstborns score high on conscientiousness. And when we ran our specification curve analysis for this personality outcome, what you can see here is actually a couple of negative effects that would be in line with his theoretical framework, because a negative effect means that later borns have lower scores. We did the overall analysis of the specification curve, and unfortunately we had a p-value that is kind of ambiguous. So normally I'd say, oh, this is maybe just chance, but of course, I mean, in this case, it would be very convenient for us to dismiss this as a chance finding. So what's going on here? Is there an effect or is there no effect? And so this is where the second panel of the specification curve comes in handy, because now we can take a look of what's actually going on here. And if you look at the bottom row here, you can see that actually all of these significant effects are within family analyses, and most of them are in analyses that do not control for age. So what's going on here? Well, within family analyses, you're actually comparing siblings, and the firstborn is per definition always older than his or her younger siblings. So there is systematic confounding with age. And we know from research into personality development that conscientiousness increases with age. So firstborns are older and hence more mature. But now this raises a question, like, did it even make sense to include models that do not control for age? And so this really boils down to the assumed causes structure. So is the age difference a confounder, or is it actually a mediator of the birth order effect? You're older because you're the firstborn and so on. And this is actually a rather complicated question, and I haven't seen anybody in the literature discussing the causal identification of birth order effects, which I think is actually fairly complicated because there is no clear counterfactual. There's no corresponding experiment. I don't know whether you would swap babies in the womb, or it's just actually very hard. And so that example kind of led me to conclude that it's actually, so we have underspecified theories and we have a lack of substantive knowledge, what we're even trying to investigate. And that makes it really hard to distinguish between systematic variability and naive specifications, because we don't even know what could matter in which ways. And I think that is like one of the broader points I want to make, is that maybe false positives aren't our only problem, maybe not even the worst one. So I think next week Eiko Fried will give a talk on theory in psychology, and you should probably attend that as well, because I think it's very important to think about these issues as well. And then another, I think, central issue is how results are presented, because you have so many numbers and you somehow need to communicate them. So in theory, of course, you can use whatever you want to, take stable figures, but there are certain decisions that you have in any case. So, for example, you need to decide whether you want, like, present certain alternative specifications in great detail, or whether you want to give a broad overview with all possible specifications. And then you still have to decide which metric do you want to depict. Do you want to show effect sizes? Which effect size? Do you want to visualize uncertainty as well? So you might have noticed that my specification curve plots do not include standard errors. Amy Orban and Andy Shabilsky have also applied specification curves, and they actually have standard errors in their plots, I think confidence intervals, and it actually does look kind of nice. So that's a decision you have to make. And another question is, like, depending on the type of visualization, readers will not be able to link certain estimates to the specific model ingredients. So if that matters to you, you need to adjust your plot. And now we are at the point where we kind of got meta researcher degrees of freedom, where we need to decide how to average over researcher degrees of freedom. So in the literature, there have been some suggestions for how to visualize things. Here are 3 different things I've showed to you. I feel like there's no globally optimal visualization. They all have their downsides. And I think it might matter in the individual case which pieces of information are most important to the argument that you're making, which of course is again a researcher degree of freedom. And I still believe that there's a lot of room for improvement. So maybe there's somebody in the audience who has actually like a great idea for how to best present that those results and how to best integrate them. And I think a lot of people would be very happy to have a very nice way to visualize this. And of course, if you want to come up with a good way to visualize such results, you first need to get started. And I would just quickly highlight 2 packages that you could use. There's a package called Stability, which is by an economist, that essentially allows you to display the stability coefficients under dozens of sets of controls. So that is like one variation of that whole multiverse idea, though I think it has been developed in complete independence of the literature in both psychology and sociology. And then Philip Mazur has actually written a package that does specification curves in R. I've never tested this, so when I did the specification curve analysis, I wrote the code myself. I also know that there's a couple of other people working on packages for specification curves and multiverse style analyses. In any case, I think because of the nature of the problem, like running a lot of different analyses and extracting different statistical indices, whatever you choose, it will always require some tinkering. I don't think there can be like an out-of-the-box solution that works for everything. But at least for me, that's also part of the fun of the whole thing. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention, and I would be happy to answer all of your questions.
Okay, well, that was wonderful, Julia. Very much a tour de force of all of the many different ways that you can analyse your data, both correctly and incorrectly. We've had a flurry of questions coming in. I'll just lop off a few points. There is a link to the paper that you mentioned, which was published in July 2020. Which is the Nature article that you mentioned early on in your talk. So we have one question here by Nick Balau, apologies if I mispronounced the surname, which I think you have sort of picked upon preemptively in the meta hacking, but I'll ask it anyway because I think it's a worthwhile discussion to have repeated viewing on. But do you worry about scientists treating Multiverse as a silver bullet and simply throwing all possible analytical decisions into the mix, even when we have good reasons to suspect that some of these will be worse? And that's the first part. Then the second part is the recent Traveller's Guide to the Multiverse paper with Gangstad talks a lot about non-arbitrary decisions being treated as arbitrary. And this has already occurred in some of the flagship specification curve papers in the last year or two. I can give a précis of the question, but do you want to give it a go? You can also look in your Q&A chat box if you want to reread it.
Yeah, I already found it there. So
okay, great.
That's an excellent question. So I hope you've noticed that I am a bit concerned about people just treating it as a silver bullet, which it isn't. So yes, I think that's a potential problem. I think that's a potential problem for all the things that have been suggested in the science reform movement, which is probably just an expression of the way our scientific system works now. People really want to have certain answers and simple solutions that work out of the box. There's like a bigger question about the incentives and so on. But yes, I do think there's a risk that people treat it as a silver bullet. So considering the discussions surrounding some flagship specification curve papers and also the Gangstad discussion. So I have a conflict of interest considering Gangstad because he is in an ongoing dispute with a good friend of mine, Ruben Aslan. And I also know about the other controversy surrounding the screen time analysis. That was the paper by Amy Orban and Andy Shubilsky, where again I have a conflict of interest because Amy is a good friend of mine as well. But also because Jean Twenge, who criticized them, is actually citing my causal inference paper. So when you look at the details of these disputes, how to best put it? So there's that interesting fact that the decision what was arbitrary and what isn't arbitrary and what should matter is often made after the fact, and sometimes in a data-driven manner, which is of course just the same problem we essentially had before, just on like a more complicated level, because now we're not just talking about one analysis, but instead about multiple analyses. So I think it's really hard to assess that, because you need to really be an insider in the literature to be able to assess which analyses make sense. You need good knowledge about causal inference. You also need to be able to evaluate arguments. So for example, Jean Twenge has criticized that Amy and Andy are controlling potential mediators, and that would indeed be wrong. And she's citing my manuscript to make that point. But what I'm actually also saying is that you should control confounders. And so these are actually ambiguous cases. So in the individual case, it's really important to actually look at the details. And there is a certain risk that the large number of analyses presented makes people like zoom out and no longer think about single specifications in detail. So that is a potential problem. And I don't have a solution for that.
Wonderful, great. Thank you. Just to clarify, just to be clear on the paper that was shared in the Q&A, the specification curve analysis paper has been published in Nature Human Behavior. I can send a link to you now, Julia, if you like, just so you can see what I'm talking about.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, I saw the link, so I was not aware of it.
Yeah.
I'm glad to see that it's finally published. I will have to read the final version and see what we did wrong.
I think it was peak COVID, so I think you can forget that it didn't sort of pass through your attention threshold. Okay, so the next one is, I think you have already covered this because I think this is quite midway through your talk, but which program did you use for the specification curve analysis? Perhaps you can just quickly return to that.
Yeah, so so initially I contacted Simonson et al. And they shared their Stata scripts with me, but my Stata programming isn't the best, so I decided to redo everything in R. And so my code is openly shared on the OSF. And then I know that Amy took my code and adapted it a bit. So essentially we chose the tinkering solution, but there are now packages that might require less effort to actually implement them.
Okay, wonderful. So there seems to be a lot of sort of, it seems to be quite a small group of people doing this, and you share codes, and there's sort of conflicts of interest. I mean, I'm sort of hijacking the questions here, but is there any attempt to try to independently reproduce or test different ways in independent labs where there's not sort of overlapping interests and conflicts?
And what do you mean, like test the code, or? Yeah,
just to verify things. I mean, I guess what I'm trying to lean you towards is the recent initiative by, well, it's led, I think, by Katie Drax. I'm not sure whether you're aware of this, but the idea being that you have a bit like a many analyst approach, but you include in that a multiverse analysis. And I just wondered what your thoughts were of these sorts of projects and whether they're a good thing or whether we should probably look for more feasible individual level sort of realistic initiatives that can be carried out sort of in routine research.
So I don't know actually about the project you mentioned about the many analysts specification curve idea. So I do think all of these initiatives that are trying to leverage multiple researchers and so on, they are all like, I think the optimal mode of science, in my opinion. So actually, I do think it would be great if we could all always collaborate on these things and also make sure that we don't have these like overlapping interests and so on. So ideally, it's also like adversarial collaboration and so on. So that's like, I think in theory, it's ideal. In practice, I see already the issue, like I'm getting a lot of invitations to join such projects. So of course, it's always a lot of effort. And it's a lot of effort that is not being rewarded in the current incentive structure. So you don't get much out of being one of the analysts in those projects. So I do think we need to change the incentives quite a bit so that people get more excited to join in these projects and take them as the valuable projects that they are.
Yeah, so I'm just going to share my screen for the benefit of yourself and for the audience. I don't know, Trevor, could you get my slides to appear to everybody? Is that possible? Or should I say stop? Okay, great. So this is so in fact, it's very germane to what you've just said, is that there is, this project I think is sort of in partnership with the UK Reproducibility Network and the Avon Longitudinal Study. And there's a few other people who are not mentioned, but it's all there on this OSF, and I'll put the OSF link there. But the idea is to sort of do crowdsourced data analysis and data visualization as well of analytical flexibility on one data set. So it's all there. So for further reading, people can go to that page or get in touch with Katie Drax or one of the contributors to that project. So I'll ask a question by Julian Mutz. Thank you for this excellent presentation. I find the multiverse analysis approach very interesting, but I'm worried about burdening editors, reviewers and readers with too much material. If you extend this approach to more than one main explanatory variable, are there any ways to present these results in a sufficient way? Sorry, succinct way.
Yeah, so that is a very good question. So I'm actually struggling with that myself, right? Because it's like the hardest question, how to report results without burdening editors, reviewers, and so on. So I think it's an ongoing question how to best do that. So in our 2017 birth order paper, we mainly had those specification curve plots and then like a brief discussion and a table with the results, although there was of course the easy case because most of the time you found nothing. So that's always the case where it gets like kind of easier to report everything. But the moment you have more complex result, I think it is a challenge, and it is a challenge to write these things up.
Okay, and another question here, it's got a few upvotes. If for everybody who wants to, you can still keep asking questions and upvote questions that you want to be asked that have not been asked already. So one here is, should we apply multiple analysts to all fields of psychology, or should it be limited to specific areas within psychology?
So I think I can't always answer it depends, right? But I think I have to answer it depends. So I think in some fields there are rather straightforward analyses actually, and there adding more people into the mix might actually just introduce noise because there will be people who are not aware of the optimal model specification and so on. So there might be areas where it's not really adding anything. I think it's actually, I think, most used for research questions where data analytic decisions are a bit more complex. That is, so maybe I'm a bit biased here, but I think that is a lot of non-experimental research where it really depends on a lot of assumptions. And there I think it's of particular value, but there also like a lot of challenges arise. So the many analysts project I mentioned about, do dark-skinned players receive more red cards? There was something where all the psychologists were like, oh yeah, of course I can analyze that. But there's also a nice talk, I think, by Josef Brüder, a sociologist, who's just like pointing out that this can be 3 different research questions. So are we just talking about an association? Are we talking about identifying the causal effect of skin color? Because that is going to be a mess. Right, or are we talking about some predictive approach? So that is something that is also an obstacle to these many analyst approaches, because you need to ensure like a shared understanding, but working on that shared understanding might already be a valuable outcome of such a project.
Yeah, and a point that's to this and the previous response by Lisa Burton-Harris, which is there a movement extending from Multiverse many analysts that enables readers to access digitally the visualization, such that they can explore via manipulation the results in an interactive way? So if the future publications of digital text with embedded visualization software tools, which I think is a really cool kind of way to deal with this issue of bias from the experimenter and accessibilities from the reader.
Yes, so I absolutely agree with that, and I do think it's one future path to do that. I again need to refer to Ruben Arslan, who has actually been doing that, like programming Shiny apps and so on, where you can explore the data, but also doing these reproducible websites where you can actually just click your way through and you get like finished results, plots and everything, and which is pretty awesome. So I do think this is a great way forward. I also see that it's putting, once again, a certain burden on reviewers, editors, and readers in particular. So I think it's nice to provide that option, but I would also assume that many people will actually not make use of it, which is a pity, and probably also has again to do with our publication culture, where you just want to have that one PDF. But I do like these like Shiny apps and interactive visualizations, and I think they should be used more.
Great, and actually somebody in the ether has posted a link to a Shiny app that allows you to explore multiple analysis, so thanks for that. We're coming up to the hour, and there is one question that remains, which is I think somebody's been sort of more simplistic thinking and thinking more of the preventative measures. So obviously these, what we've discussed today, are how do you deal with the data that's out there already, and how do you sort of generate hypotheses that are sort of based on firm grounds. But I'm reminded, there's one here, and the question is that what do you think of simple preventative measures such as Felix Schonbrot's 21-word solution, in which authors state any empirical publication, we report how we determined our sample size, all data exclusions, if any, all manipulations, and all measures in the study. And they qualify by saying the intention being to make it untenable to selectively report the successes out of the many analyses you have run.
Yeah, I really like. So I get a conflict of interest. And I also friends, and I do think it's actually like a very like elegant solution, because it turns that like lying by omission into, if you would include this but not actually do it, then you would explicitly lie. So it's like kind of like swapping the pushes and pulls of the situation. So I do think if that works, it's very elegant. But there's so I think there's also like situations in which these decisions are fairly complex and so on. And you might have tried different things. So at least in my field, where it's observational research, there's often multiple analyses that you have run. And in that case, like the full transparency essentially results in the same problem, that you somehow need to report like a large number of things you did and so on. So I think you come back to that problem: how do you report what you did in a manner that readers can follow, that is fully transparent, and that doesn't make people just skip over the sections? And that is like a really hard balance, and a hard balance for all multiverse analyses and for full transparency as well.
I think that would be a great way to finish, actually. That was a wonderful summary and a sort of pitch for next steps. So yes, we are at the hour, so sorry to everybody, but don't worry, all of the content will be made publicly available on our YouTube channel, and also on our OSF page. We'll deposit the slides. We usually upload everything on Mondays, so you can digest everything and return to it after the weekend. From us at the Rights team, thank you very much, Julia. It's been an absolutely fascinating talk. It's been lovely to see this sort of stream of positive feedback on Twitter. And again, thanks everybody for the questions. Next week, as Julia very helpfully pointed out, we have a talk by Eiko Fried, and he's going to be hosted by our site at Rotterdam. So please do stay tuned for that. It's on the 29th, 2 p.m. UK time, and I think it's 1 hour ahead in the Netherlands. So do look out for the tweets and links to that. So thank you again, Julia, and see everybody next week.
Thank you for inviting me.
Bye. No problem.
Bye.